To start the webinar in a good way, I want to introduce Allan Claxton. Allan's serving as the Development Board Chair for the First Nations Infrastructure Institute, and Allan has a lot of experience dealing with infrastructure projects in his time serving as Chief and as Councillor for Sayo First Nation in British Columbia on the West Coast, for those that may not be familiar. So thanks for joining us this morning, Allan. How are you?
Very good. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for those kind words. As Jason said, welcome to webinar number 3, Managing Risk Through Procurement. Territories that we're all presenting from today and enjoying this webinar. I'm from the Sayo Village in the Sandwich Nation, and we have some technical support up in the Kamloops area and even as far as New Zealand. So I want to recognize the development board. We have a good development board that's been working on this for approximately over 3 years. But I also want to acknowledge Jason and the technical team. Throughout this whole time, we've never gone into a meeting unprepared for presentations, whether it's with the federal government or the communities or these webinars or national meetings. So I really appreciate the technical team that does so much work. It was almost a year ago, I remember, Jason and I were in a meeting in Toronto. It was housing and infrastructure. And when the meeting was over, we flew home. Jason to Vancouver and me right through to Victoria. The very next day, the country shut down. The world has never been the same. Our country has never been the same. And these have been very difficult times for all of our communities across this great land of ours. And so I want you to think about those people that are going through hardships and say a little prayer for them. Keep them in your minds and thoughts and hearts. And especially the youth and the elders. The elders probably can't see the people, the families that they want to see, that give them so much support. And the kids, they need to be out there doing their sports and other things that have been shut down as well. So we ask the Creator to keep us safe and give us strength and compassion through these difficult times, and also open our hearts and minds and give us understanding for the presentation that we're going to hear today and the great work that's gone into it, and to continue to give us compassion for each other and understanding for each other and help us move forward in a positive way. So with that in mind, Jason, let's get into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Allan, for that those opening comments and prayer. And again, thank you to everyone joining us today for this third in our series of 5 shovel-ready webinars. We put this series together because now in times of COVID, we can't gather the way we used to, but we know the challenges that we face with infrastructure have not gone away. And we thought these webinars would be an opportunity to talk about how to address some of these infrastructure challenges. And today we're going to talk about managing risk through procurement. What is procurement? Why is it important? What are the different models that are out there? What are the advantages of some of the models? What are some of the disadvantages of models? How to think about what model might be best for you and for your project. So really looking forward to the discussion. Just as a quick housekeeping note, we do encourage you to make use of the chat function. We are a small group today. It's not the webinar format in technical sense that we've got it set up as a meeting, so we can see all of you, and we can engage hopefully. So please feel free to make use of that chat function. We'll keep tabs on it. We're fortunate today to be joined by 2 members of the Vinny technical team. I see John Dumbrell has joined us, which is great. He's calling in from Kamloops, British Columbia today, and Vinny Minnet, who's calling in from New Zealand. Both John and Vinny, valuable members of our Vinny technical team who have a lot of experience with infrastructure and more specifically with procurement. And they're going to describe some of the thinking and planning, about these different approaches that may be helpful. So we do have some slides that we're going to put up in a sec and do the share screen thing. Just so you know, like we'll make the slides available, so don't feel like you have to copy stuff down or anything like that. If you end up after wanting to learn a little bit more about Vinny, you can go to fnii.ca, and there's actually a tab there about resources that you can click on the menu, and it'll take you to some different documents, or there's the webinar page that has copies of the slides. So I really encourage you to just have a look around there. So before I guess, well, you know what, I'll start the share screen thing here. Hopefully that's working. And we have a few slides to describe about procurement, but I was thinking this morning, as I was thinking about getting a cup of coffee, that we tend to procure stuff all the time. In fact, I had to go out and procure my cup of coffee this morning. I don't think about it very much when I go to get my cup of coffee. There's a regular place I get it. It's the same size. I get the medium size. I get the medium roast, and then I drink it and it's gone. It's not very expensive, but that's in a way procuring something. What about something else that I procure from time to time, like for argument's sake, a black t-shirt. I know how to go online and buy it. There's a couple of different things I need. I need to know the size. I know the color. I want it to be black, and I tend to be a bit particular. I like it to be cotton, but that's about it. It's pretty simple, and then it shows up. But then if I think about something even a little bit more complicated, like say the washing machine broke down, and I had to go buy a new washing machine. Now I'm going out to procure something, which is something that's a little bit more complicated. It's more expensive. It's going to last for a while. I have to think about the features on the washing machine. And then they always ask, it's these situations I find, like, do you want to get the warranty for it? The extended warranty, even if you go like get a pair of headphones or something like that. I know it seems like, do you want the Apple Care program, or so you start to think about the features of these products and what do they offer, and what are the ongoing support I'm going to have, to make sure the product works for a while. And I think about like going out to get a car that's even more expensive, has more different features on it. Even the same models, I know now there's like 4 different versions of them that have maybe different wheels, or they have different motor or different stereo, and you got to think about which, all these options, that what do you want it for your purpose? Like, what do you think is more valuable? And what's the value proposition to you of having that better stereo, or is it really worth the money? And what about the warranty? How long does that last? And what does it cover, that warranty? So, these are kind of maybe silly examples, but examples I think about of procuring something, and those are pretty straightforward things. But we start thinking about infrastructure. These can start to get kind of complicated projects. Like if we thought about a water system, who's going to get connected to the system in our community? Is it going to be members? Is it going to be health center? Is it going to be the elder center? Is it going to be the school? What about lease land? Are there non-members who are living on your lands who are leasing? Are there businesses located on lease land? How are they going to get connected? Where's the treatment plant going to go? What are the technology options? There's a lot of questions and thinking about how to develop this project. And so we think about procuring that kind of a project, providing the kind of guidance and the information you need up front. It's really important. And procurement starts to become a really big deal about how you pursue these different options and how you describe what it is that you're trying to develop for your own community. So I say that by the way of introduction, and the people who are going to talk about this have more experience and knowledge about this than I do, and we're fortunate to be joined by them. So I'm going to stop talking now and introduce John Dumbrell. John, really happy you can join us today. John stepped forward to participate on the technical team. He has 3 decades of experience in infrastructure projects, both with Indigenous groups and with other governments in Canada. So John, thanks for joining us. And I'm gonna move on to the next slide, which I know you prepared a couple of slides here for us to think about. What is procurement and why is it important? And then where does it fit in with the life cycle? And I wonder if you'd be willing to share your thoughts about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jason, and good morning again, everyone. So um, this this whole notion of procurement, it reminds me of one of the initiatives that we took as Vinny. We're working on what are called proof of concept projects to sort of prove out this notion of what the First Nations Infrastructure Institute would be all about. And so one of those projects is in a place called with the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point, Anishinaabe Nation, located just west of London, Ontario. And so we've had a number of meetings in the community that are looking at improving their wastewater system to serve both members as well as a number of lease lots, around 500 lease lots that are on Lake Huron. And so as part of those meetings, those public meetings, we mentioned this notion of procurement. And I so vividly recall a chief, one of the longstanding chiefs of the nation, and an elder in the community that stood up at one of the meetings and said, "Excuse me, Sonny, what's this procurement thing that you keep talking about?" So it's always been stuck in my mind that we use this term quite a bit, but it is not all that well understood. So Jason, thank you so much for your earlier example about getting a cup of coffee. But just like to spend a couple of minutes here, maybe delving into a little bit more about what procurement actually is and why it's important in the community. So, so nations often need to reach outside organizations to hire others because of there could be a number of limitations. It could be the time available to move forward with the project. It could be the experience that's available within staff, chief and council, members in the community. There's the skills that they might be able to bring to it, or equipment, for example, and so, or a combination of those things. And so, for those reasons, the nations often have to reach out there outside the organization to move forward with designing, constructing, and so on an infrastructure project. That whole process of reaching outside is what we refer to as procurement. There's so many different processes that could be taken to procure services from outside the organization. I won't go into really any detail around this at this point because I know one of the other technical team members, Vinny, will be dealing with this in just a couple of moments. Sometimes those procurement processes could involve direct hiring without a competitive process if there's a well-established relationship between the nation and the service provider. And then in some cases, there's a competitive process involved, which is, we often hear that term, requests for proposals. There's also a whole bunch of different ways of packaging services together. Again, Vinny will get much more thoroughly into this, but a good example there could be the way in which infrastructure is designed, built, and then operated and maintained. These things can be procured either through a separate individual process, in other words, design separate from building, or could be packaged together into one procurement. So when we use this notion of procurement, this is really some of the key things that we've got in mind. If I could have the next slide. Yeah, why is this important? So again, here we started to think about it, and Jason for sure alluded to this in his earlier analogy, is that procurement is often associated with big and expensive infrastructure projects. So these could be projects such as a water treatment plant, a wastewater plant, a major road connection, a subdivision serving member needs, and so on, that could be really expensive to build, and then also the ongoing operating cost to maintain. In addition to costs, these infrastructure projects we see are typically really important to a number of other objectives of the community that could be expressed through things such as the comprehensive community plan, the council strategic plan, and so on. These would be things where we think about things here like the health of the community, providing clean drinking water, safety within the community, making sure that the road network and transportation network is safe, education services, making sure that the school building is good for the students and teachers, and so on. So there's a number of other objectives well beyond cost that are really important when we think about procurement and the services that are delivered through it. Another important reason, the time frame to move forward with the design and building of an infrastructure project can go really smoothly or it can be complicated by delays due to a number of different circumstances. The design could not have been well done. There could be friction between the builder and the designer of the infrastructure. Perhaps an inexperienced building contractor could have been sort of unwittingly awarded the project, or various other circumstances. So when those occur, it can increase the time required to build the nation's infrastructure. If things do go wrong, unfortunately, health, safety, and other aspects of community life can be compromised. And then all of these things, which we would characterize as risk, in other words, cost, safety, quality of service, can be managed through a good procurement process. So that, just by way of kind of introduction around, again, what is this notion of procurement, and why is it seen as being important? Okay, I've sort of alluded to this a couple of times in the prior conversation, but when we're thinking about infrastructure, we always acknowledge that there's a life cycle to that infrastructure. And so what we've got depicted on this slide here are the main components of that infrastructure life cycle. So it would begin with pre-planning. I would again think of things like the comprehensive community plan. Many nations would have a land use plan that would express how different uses of the land would be manifested on that land base, where the residential areas would be located, where the commercial areas would be located, areas that are culturally valuable and sensitive, environmentally sensitive areas, and so forth. So as part of pre-planning, it really will set out the objectives of the community and how those could be expressed on the land base. That pre-planning often involves too the infrastructure required to service those different land uses. How is the water system going to work its way around to serve the commercial and residential areas? Where's the road network going to be located, and so on? So when we think of pre-planning, it's in addition to land use, it's also the infrastructure pieces that come with that. So then if we think about isolating on any one piece of that infrastructure, and maybe I'll just use water supply as an example. Then if that needs to be upgraded, the next step in the infrastructure life cycle is something that's referred to as a feasibility study. There could be many ways of developing that water infrastructure. Where's the water supply coming from? How might it be treated to make sure that it's safe and clean for nation members and economic development activities to utilize? How is it going to be distributed around the community? Where's the storage facility? Make sure that there's enough water for high demand periods and fight fires and things like that. So all of those things are sorted out through something called a feasibility study. Then once the feasibility study is concluded, then it can put together what we refer to as a business case. I think I'll just leave that one for a moment, because I know some of the slides that are coming up here in just a moment will speak more specifically to what the components of the business case to move forward with that piece of infrastructure, the water system, will comprise. Once the business case is done, then we're on to procurement to say, okay, we need this water system upgrade. We've prepared a good business case to support its advancement. Now, how are we going to step outside the organization to procure the services to move forward with the last three notches on the life cycle scenario here? Procure the services to design that water system, to build it, to operate and maintain it, and then eventually, way down the road, hopefully 50 plus years, to replace components of the system as they begin to wear out. So we just wanted, I guess, to give a general sense of how procurement, that we're focused on this morning, fits into this overall life cycle of the infrastructure. So Jason, Allan, and others on the call, if I might leave it at that point and turn it back over. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John, so much for walking through that. Like, you know, one of the interesting things that has come in my mind as we've been working through these issues, just before we leave this life cycle, is if you don't have maybe the right information up front, if you don't spend enough time, you know, making sure the community objectives are aligned with the project up front, and you start down a path that's not the right path for the community. What does that mean? It means maybe there wasn't enough information about environmentally sensitive areas or areas of environmental concern. Maybe there wasn't enough awareness of land use or what the community objectives are. Maybe there wasn't awareness of the appropriate capacity development required for operation and maintenance, and you decide to select a technology option that's not appropriate or doesn't work well for where you are. Somehow, because there isn't the right information being communicated between parties in these early stages, you start down a path that isn't a path that's going to work well for the nation, and you end up having problems later. But sorry, John, not to put you on the spot with questions here, but I just wonder if you'd be able to reflect on, the importance of setting the table properly, in the pre-planning, in engaging with the right people at the community so that information can be exchanged properly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because, focusing on just sort of one individual infrastructure project, like water, for example, without that broader context of how it really does fit into the community, what land uses it's going to serve, what economic development activities it's going to serve. Like in the absence of that, they become almost, if you will, ad hoc projects, as opposed to projects that are really well integrated with the overall objectives of the community: land use, the economic development, the environmental, certainly the health and wellness and other objectives. So that pre-planning we see as really an important piece to the success of an infrastructure project.
Great, thanks, John. And I know I've advanced the slide here. Tried to create this to describe a scenario. We know that different nations will have different strengths and different experiences and different capacities. But we also know that, for any given project, certain things need to happen for the project to work well. Like John just mentioned, through those different steps. And I think in a few minutes, Vinny's going to even go into a bit more detail in some of the steps, for example, the business case or the procurement options analysis. So, nations have developed strengths in certain areas. Why? Well, partly I would argue because the current system, in infrastructure development has certain areas where nations are able to operate, and in other areas there's just not that much flexibility. The system doesn't enable nations really to assert their jurisdiction and have decision-making power in other areas. So, the whole idea, I think, behind the Fiscal Management Act, behind Vinny, is for nations to assert their jurisdiction over their lands, and that includes infrastructure. And so what we have in this slide here is a scenario, again, saying, well, if all these things need to happen in a project lifecycle, where are the nation's strengths right now? And where are there some opportunities maybe where there could be some support to make sure that all those things in the project that need to get done are going to happen, and they're going to be done in a good way using best practices that have been tried and tested by different governments in different places all around the world. So I think that's I just say that again as to provide some context about where we see I think an opportunity for nations to strengthen their infrastructure planning processes, strengthen their procurement processes, make sure that their projects are going to get developed in a way that meets their objectives. Again, this is one scenario. There could be others, but I think that's a helpful process to think through. I know we talked about business case, John mentioned here, and I think I've mentioned a couple of times. I'm just reflecting back to the last two webinars. Some of you may have attended the last couple of webinars. Others may, this is your first time at a Vinny webinar. We did talk in a bit more detail about that business case phase, and really we think the business case is a one-stop shop to describe the project, and it's comprised of a number of parts, including this, these 5 parts that you can see on the slide: the strategic, the economic, the commercial, the financial, and the management kind of chapters to the business case. I'm not going to read through all these bullets on the slide. they are available. Again, we're kind of building up different concepts and in these webinars. There is discussion in the business case about something called the commercial case. And in that commercial case, we talk about an evaluation of different procurement options. So I think at this point, maybe this is a good opportunity for me to stop talking and to introduce Vinny Minnet. Vinny's coming to us from the future, which is amazing because he's in New Zealand and it's tomorrow there already. But Vinny has a lot of experience with infrastructure projects, both in New Zealand and in Canada. And we're happy that he's able to join us today to talk about the Vinny process and how procurement fits in.
Good morning, Jason and everyone on the call. Like Jason said, yeah, I am dialing in from Auckland. I recently returned back through COVID. I was living in Vancouver, but now back in Auckland, New Zealand, and it is Friday morning here. The future's nice. It's okay. It's still here. Thank you, Jason, for I guess the introduction, and John for running through such a very, I guess, clear description of what we're talking about when we say procurement. You know, like Jason said at the beginning, procurement can really mean buying anything, and we're talking about it specifically in an infrastructure sense. So it can sometimes be, I guess, a little bit confusing as to what exactly we're meaning. This process that's up on the slide at the moment goes through what we've categorized as the Vinny process. There's 4 distinct phases, and it sort of fits quite well with the project lifecycle that John talked about. The project identification phase is really the pre-planning and sort of early feasibility. It sort of, you know, highlights what the project is, puts the bounds around what we're trying to do. The business case development phase is what Jason was just talking about. That's the strategic, economic, commercial, financial management. I like to think of that as the strategic is the why are you doing what you're doing. The economic is what are you doing. You know, so the why is, you know, we really need, you know, the really clear things like clean drinking water, or, you know, a functioning wastewater system. The strategic rationale around that's quite clear. The economic case is what is it? So John said, you know, you're going to do your feasibility study. You're going to say which process are we using to treat the water? Where are we getting our water source from? Is it coming from a river or groundwater or a lake or whatever it might be? And then the commercial case, which is what we're here to talk about more, is how are you going to deliver that? So often, you know, jurisdictions, nations all around the world will just kind of roll on organically, and they'll go, okay, we know what we're going to do. We had an engineering firm or a design firm doing our feasibility study. They'll just keep sort of designing this asset, and then we'll go out and we'll get a builder to build it, and then we'll go out and we'll find, you know, we'll either maintain it ourselves and operate it ourselves, or we'll find a third party to do that for us. That's what we would call traditional procurement, or design, bid, build, and we're going to get onto what all the other types of procurement are on the next slide. But that's one way of doing it, and there's no right way or wrong way to do procurement. It's more what the right model is for the project that you're doing, and that's really what we're trying to say, and what we're trying to emphasize. Like I said, historically, the way that Indigenous Services Canada has procured infrastructure for First Nations has really, really heavily relied on design, bid, build. And there's some pros of that model, but there's a lot of kind of downsides, particularly in the types of infrastructure that are being procured. Just really quickly here, the next phase down being the procurement phase. Once you get through the business case development phase, it's actually going out and doing it, and planning for that up front, and really sort of thinking about how you're going to bring on the parties, you know, to do the work. How you're going to pay them, what the process is. Sorry, my lights are going out here, so I'm just going to try and get those to come back on. And how you're going to you know, evaluate, you know, if you're getting tenders back, and how you're going to evaluate those are really important. So Jason, if you want to jump forward to the next slide there. Sorry. This is the overview of procurement models. So when we say procurement models, we're talking about different methods, different models to deliver an asset, to buy an asset, have that asset built, and then operate that asset. Often we talk about the different contracts that are behind these. Obviously, those get fairly complicated. So at a high level, we've got 5 models on the screen there. It's a world that's full of acronyms, so I'm going to do my best not to use any acronyms, because it does get quite confusing. But down in the bottom left corner there in yellow is the design, bid, build that I talked about earlier. At the moment, I would say that's how 99% of projects in First Nations are delivered, and probably 80-odd% of projects worldwide. That number might be coming down now as people start to embrace more of these alternative models. The axis on this graph, it's really just illustrative, but you're looking at how much risk you're transferring. John talked about risk transfer earlier. How much risk you're transferring away from you and over to a third party. And on the horizontal axis there, it's how much private sector involvement there is. So that's not necessarily the people doing the work, it's more private sector integration. How much responsibility do they have for various elements of the project? If we touch on design, bid, build again, and probably the type of procurement that you're all more familiar with is, you go out and you have someone design an asset for you, and then you take that design, you get happy with that design, you sign that off, you take that out and you go to the market or to a particular contractor and you say, can you please build this for me? Often if you run a competition for that, if you do a request for proposal process, they'll come back to you with a lowest price, and you'll do a price competition, and they go, okay, we'll build that asset for $5 million. If you're talking a small school or whatever it might be, a triplex, you then say, okay, that gets built. They built it to the design that you signed off, and they go, okay, here's your building. And then you might go out and say, hey, either we're going to maintain and operate that ourselves, or we're going to hire someone else, a third party, some cleaners, a cleaning company, whatever it might be. Every time that contract changes hands and that responsibility changes hands from the design to the construction, from the construction to the operations, that creates a risk, and we call that an interface risk between those. A really good example, which is a real life example in Canada, is a water tower facility. They had an engineering firm in to design the water tower. It got, the design looked good. The engineers said, this is what you need. And the First Nation there signed off that asset. They then took that out to tender for construction. They got a construction firm in to build it, and the construction firm built it to the exact specifications of the design. Then when they went to use that asset, it turned out that it wasn't actually fit for purpose. It didn't work with the situation in the community. And instead of improving water pressure and reliability, it actually hindered that. The First Nation went back to the builder and they said, hey, what's going on here? And they said, you signed off on the design. You gave us the design. We built what you asked us to build. They then went back to the engineer, and the engineering firm said, well, you signed off on our design. We worked through this with you collaboratively. We did what you asked us to do. So really, at the end of the day, those risks, those interface risks, fall back on the First Nation or on the person buying the infrastructure. As we move up and we talk about the level of private sector involvement, I'll touch on just design build and then maybe design build maintain. Jason, just really quickly, if I've got the time there. Design build is where, instead of going out and saying, hey, we want you to design the asset and then we want another firm to build it, we actually say we want responses from the private sector to design and build this facility. So you're not going out and you're not going out with a design, you're going out with what we call an output specification or a performance specification. Essentially, you're saying, here's what we want this asset to do. So just continuing to use the water example, you might say we have 100 homes in our community and we want to have the water to a certain quality, and there's lots of measurements you can use for water quality, and we want it to flow out of the taps at a certain rate. So you can say, you can go with that out to a design builder, and that will either be one firm or two firms who might join up to work on the project. And then their responsibility is to come to you with designs. So it allows for, we talk about innovation a lot. It's not saying you need to get the water from this river and you need to clean it using this process, and then you need to put it through this size pipes. It's actually saying, hey, we don't care about that. That's not our specialty. What we care about is that our community members have water coming to their homes, and that water is clean and safe to drink, and it's reliable. And that puts the interface risk between the design and construction onto a different party. As you move up towards the top right there, design, build, maintain, that's bringing in the third component, the maintenance component, and saying, actually, now we want a party to design it, build it, and maintain it. The risk that you're transferring there is what we call whole of life risk. So once you've built an asset, you then need to maintain it. And what happens if 5 years down the road, it stops working? You know, you have a school and the roof is no longer stable, or it's a leaky building. Obviously, you know, Vancouver and Canada more broadly has had a big problem with leaky buildings. Who do you go back to? You can't really go back to your builder in a lot of cases, because the warranty period's expired. You may have had a 2-year warranty, you know, sort of defects. And you go to your maintainer and they're just doing what they were hired to do. You know, they're cleaning, they're painting the walls when they need to, they're clearing the gutters. In this situation, it's likely to be the same firm, or like I said, a group of firms who've got together to respond to it. So you can actually have some recourse, some protection if that is to occur. So sorry, Jason, I can talk about these for far too long. So if you jump onto the next slide there. Yeah, so this is more how you might choose a model. Like I said, there's no wrong model, and I think that's really important. People have good or bad experiences with different models and then like to use those going forward. So design, bid, build, there's a lot of positives to it. It is fairly simple to understand. It's linear, meaning you do one activity and then another activity and then another activity. So you've got places and you've got checks and balances all the way through. What's up on screen here is some procurement objectives or evaluation criteria that you might use when you're looking at which model is right for your project. The first one there is talking about maximizing competition. So one really good way to get good prices and get the market, you know, contractors to respond to you is to have them competing. You know, people are more likely to give you a better price if they really want to win the work, and they think there's other bidders who are giving you a price as well. Cost certainty, the second one. John talked a lot about risks. A lot of risks can be transferred into a price. You know, if you get someone to come in and you say, we want to build a school on this piece of land, and they say, okay, we'll do it for $10 million. They come in, they start digging on the land that you have, and they find that the land's unstable. You know, they're going to come back and they're going to say, hey, we actually need to change all of the foundations. We need to excavate. We need to remove a lot more material. And it's going to cost a lot more. You gave us the land. We didn't look at the land. We didn't, you know, necessarily certify that the land was good to build on. So you're going to need to pay for that. And we can't deliver the school on it until we get the additional money and sort of improve the foundations. So that translates through to cost. That's a risk that translates through to cost. So are there models, you know, can you use a different model to get better cost certainty? The third one, there's flexibility. It's looking at, you know, what do you want to be able to do with the asset? When do you want to be able to change the asset? That can be impacted by different models. Design, bid, build is actually one of the most positive models for flexibility. But it's really important to look at when you might need flexibility and why you might need flexibility. Risk transfer, obviously, it's kind of all about risk. This is looking at, you know, are there any really specific heightened risks for your project, and could a particular model deal with them better? You know, if you think there's a really high risk around the operations of the asset, then you might look at a model that includes the operations in the original procurement process. And lastly, contractor incentive. Incentives are another major element. It's what you're trying to encourage people to do. On a low cost bid, so if you go out to 3 bidders and say, or 3 construction firms and say, please bid on this project, and we're going to appoint the one with the lowest price, which is often the way it happens. The incentive there is for them to cut corners. Cut corners is a bad way to say it, but to cut as much as they can while just meeting your requirements. So, you know, they might say, hey, we can do it for $100. Another guy says, I can do it for $80. It might be that they are able to do it more efficiently, but it might be that they've found a way to to use a cheaper material, which may end up costing you in the long run. If you say to a person, hey, you actually have to operate it for 10 years afterwards, they're going to look at a flooring material and they're going to say, actually, if I put this flooring material in, I'm going to have to replace it in 5 years' time, and that's going to be my responsibility. So I might use a higher quality material, which might cost more upfront, but it might be cheaper and more efficient to operate in the long run. So those are just a couple of the, another criteria that we consider a lot is local involvement and sort of First Nation involvement. And that can be included in all models, but we also often look at other evaluation criteria, which might be project specific. Thank you, Jason. Is there another? I think that's my last slide there, isn't it?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Vinny. That's really helpful. I know it's a lot of different models and different ways to evaluate them, and lots of discussion about risk, which is really the topic of our webinar today. So interesting to think about how nations have, or Indigenous groups or other governments have used these different models for better or for worse. And I know, I think one of the things we hope with Vinny is that, Vinny would be a center of excellence to build on lots of best practices and good models to, hopefully, like John mentioned, this isn't if you're doing a water plant, for example, or a school, this isn't something you're going to do every 5 years. It's going to be something you're going to do once in a generation, hopefully. But having said that, the difficulty with that is that you may not have a lot of experience dealing with projects to know the pitfalls to avoid or the best practices to use. And that's really, I think, the idea behind Vinny is to, bring some bench strength to the team to support, the team in developing that project. So I want to turn back to John Dumbrell and ask, I know John, both you and Vinny have experience with different projects, but John, I wonder if you would be willing to provide some comments just on, where you've seen different procurement models go well, and maybe some that you haven't, or just some anecdotes from your experience of going through this process, I think would be helpful.
Sure. Thank Jason and Vinny. And so, just in thinking about this and the different, as Jason mentioned, the different procurement models. I think, as Jason mentioned, I do work with an engineering firm here in Kamloops, and so we're kind of in the center, if you will, of these procurement approaches that Vinny has referred to, and in a number of different ways. In some cases, we're the designer in a design bid build environment. In other cases, we're linking directly with the builder, the contractor, in a design build. And then in other cases, we're involved much more on the design as the designer in the design bid build, design build and operate model, or operate and maintain model. So we've been fortunate to be involved kind of in the center of a number of those. And so reflecting on those experiences, just wanted to share with the group this morning some of our, some of our learnings. So I think I'll use as an example the water projects, which we referred to a number of times this morning, not any specific ones, but kind of more generally. And within the water project, I'd like to start with the design bid build model. So Vinny's already touched on this in many ways in terms of how that kind of process typically evolves. So there, the engineer will design the system and express what's needed in terms of the design in something that are referred to as a tender document. And those tender documents are then circulated publicly via BC Bid or various different procurement systems that are available. So then the contractors receive those tender documents and they submit their bids. In fact, almost every circumstance, the lowest bid is chosen, and Vinny has sort of pointed to some of the challenges there. And then the building of the water system starts. Sometimes this whole process that I've just described occurs without sufficient engagement of the community, including, like, really importantly in the case of all infrastructure, the public works department within the nation, and then on an operations team if there is a specific piece of infrastructure like a water treatment plant. Then what can happen, and again, Vinny has described some of these as the unanticipated circumstances and surprises that might pop up during the course of construction. They could relate to soil conditions. They could relate to, as digging is taking place, there's some utilities that are found in the ground that people weren't aware of. They could have been things that were missed during the design process that the designer wasn't aware of. So there are all of these unanticipated circumstances that could occur. Then what happens is changes, where something called change orders to the contract. So under the design bid build, after the work is awarded, a contract is signed, and then the contractor can come back and say, oh, we need a change order because we encountered this unanticipated circumstance. That inevitably results in higher costs. It often results in schedule delays because something, again, unanticipated was discovered, and that's going to take us an extra month or whatever the case is. So the schedule gets delayed. Sometimes if the unanticipated circumstance is substantial enough, the actual scope of the project needs to be reduced because there's a set budget for it. And we need to spend an extra $100,000 on something that we didn't anticipate here. So we have to get that 100,000 from elsewhere. So there's all these different implications that can happen as a result of these unanticipated circumstances. Finger pointing often happens, and again, Vinny mentioned this earlier, where the builder would say, "Oh, that wasn't on the design, so that must be the engineers or the architect's challenge." The engineer or architect says, "Oh, well, sorry, you should be able to build that without any challenges." So you get this friction that can develop to try to determine who's responsible for the problem. So these are some of the implications that can happen under the design bid build model. It is, as Vinny mentioned again, a very common approach, and certainly one that's used almost exclusively by Indigenous Services Canada when involved in funding First Nations projects. So what are some of the reasons that others are moving forward with some of the other approaches that Vinny mentioned here? So that would be, for example, the design build model, or the design build operate and maintain model. So we're seeing a whole number of reasons in the marketplace for why that's happening. First off, and most importantly, and again, I work with an engineering firm, and so we design things. What we've really found is that we can learn a tremendous amount from those that are actually building the project. So these are the contractors that if we engage directly with them during the course of the design exercise, we can learn a bunch from them, and we hope that they can learn things from us too. We might be aware of new technologies, for example, that the contractor isn't aware of. And so it becomes very much more of a team effort where the builders learn from the designers, and certainly the designers learn from the builders. These can help to really reduce the number of the problems that I mentioned above. And also it can definitely help to deal with the transfer of risk to avoid some of those potential problems, extra cost, time delays, the quality of the service not being good, and so on. So then I'd just like to get maybe a bit more granular on some of the other options that Vinny mentioned there, other than the design bid build model. So thinking about design build here, and I'm thinking back to the life cycle that we described earlier. We'll recall on there that there was the pre-planning, then there was the feasibility study that said, okay, this kind of infrastructure is feasible to develop for our community to address the objectives that we have. So after that feasibility is done, here's where one team, the design build team, is hired to design and build the infrastructure. There's no tendering process, and there can be much less friction, as I described earlier, between the designer and builder. One of the things in it, as part of the feasibility study or as a supplement to it that is important to think about, is some additional preliminary work to really define the existing conditions that will be expressed to the design and builder when they move forward with designing the infrastructure and building it. So what do I mean there? Well, those are things like, if we're thinking of the water supply example, getting a really good understanding of the nature of the proposed water supply, what contaminants might be in that water supply, what the best way to treat it is. All of those things are really dependent on having a really good understanding of the existing condition of the water supply in order to move forward with a proper design and then construction of how to make that water supply potable. So that could be essentially an additional little study on the existing water supply. Another might be, what's the scope of the distribution system? Who's going to be connected into this water system? And how much water demand is required there? So when setting it up for a design build, it could be really important to have these additional pieces of information there that the designer and build team can then take away and do a really good job on what they need to do. Here, again, Vinny mentioned this earlier, a performance specification or an output specification that says, here's the quality of the water that needs to be produced from this existing supply. And by the way, here's our good report on the existing supply. And here's how much water needs to be delivered to these taps at this volume. Is really helpful here in setting the stage for these design builds. Back to community, I mentioned earlier that sometimes there's not sufficient engagement of the community, and certainly those public works and operations people within the community. They absolutely need to be designed in the lead up to the design build to make sure that the infrastructure is really going to be serving those community needs. And they too will be the ones under this model that will be heavily involved in the operations after. So they sure need to be involved at the front end. So then kind of moving on to design, build, and maintain. Again, Vinny mentioned that as a model earlier. There's a lot of similarities there with design build. It's adding that maintenance piece on afterwards. This too occurs after the feasibility study. So we've gone through the pre-planning and the feasibility study, and then the procurement decision to move forward with this model. So a good example here of a design, build, maintain arrangement might be, again, using water as an example, where the water treatment plant is designed by the engineering group, it's constructed by the building contracting group. And then the maintenance, this would be things like, for example, a filtration system to make sure that to filter the water, make sure it's clean, changing the filters. If there's a storage reservoir involved, sometimes there's sediment that falls to the bottom of the storage reservoir, cleaning that out on a regular basis and those kind of things. So those would be the kind of groupings of activities that would be put within the design, build, and maintain package. Over and above that, the maintenance part, what we do see in a number of communities is operations being added to that as well. So, so beyond the designing, building, and the periodic maintenance is the actual day-to-day operations of the water utility. This is by the way most common with water and wastewater utilities, and then also with some buildings as well in nation communities where operations is added. And here it's really important to add or to put as part of the procurement documentation and contract what those operations responsibilities would include. They can be very hands-on activities. In other words, that the private sector operator is there on a daily basis, turning the dials and monitoring the water quality, all of those kind of things. Or it could be much more in an advisory type capacity. We're certainly aware of and involved in some really good examples where the current nation's operating staff are integrated with this contract operation. So I guess to say that another way, like it is by no means a situation where if a nation decides, in the case of a water project or wastewater project or a building operations, that the existing public works and operations staff need to be, if you will, set aside, and then strictly a private sector contractor brought in to do that. That is not necessarily the case at all. Much more familiar with situations where a contractor operator could be brought in more in an advisory capacity to really supplement and build a good working relationship with the nation operators and be able to strengthen those operators' capacity through a mentoring type arrangement. So these again are becoming more common arrangements. And when we think back to the procurement part of it, here it's really specifying what those operations functions will comprise, and put those into the procurement documents that people are responding to. So there's a number of other approaches, but just wanted to kind of touch on some of those main ones that Vinny has identified, and also, I guess, describe that a lot of the thinking that needs to go into the front end of the procurement documentation that's sent out to the marketplace to say, we're reaching outside of our organization. We would like to retain someone to help us with some combination of these activities to make sure that we're delivering good infrastructure in the community. Davis, I wonder if maybe just quickly we could pop up that slide that talks about working together. I think it was maybe the last slide in the deck. It was up just a moment ago. Great, thank you. Yeah. So how does all of this kind of fit together with this notion of how Vinny would work together? And I'll just touch on this because I think Jason may wish to describe this a little more later as well. But this whole notion of procurement, reaching outside the nation organization, certainly fits in with the Vinny model. Where it would, I guess, be explicitly defined would be within that external advisors that's over on the far right-hand side, where the external advisors that are designing the infrastructure, that are building it, that are potentially maintaining and operating it, would form as part of the nation organization, and along with Vinny, the project team, to achieve those objectives that are shown on the bottom row there, which is to develop the project right from the planning through to operations and maintenance, delivering the project, and then absolutely transferring knowledge with the community that they're working with. So with that, Jason and others, thank you very much for your indulgence to be able to walk through some of the, I guess, a bit more of the granular stuff that we see as an engineering firm being involved in these different types of procurement processes.
Thanks so much, John. As again, we're really fortunate to have your knowledge and experience to think through these issues. And I really appreciate you taking the time and going through, those models and talking about your experience with them. I know Davis has put a comment in the chat here, and we'd love to have feedback from you. I think Vinny is going to have a couple more minutes with us, unfortunately, before he has another commitment. But just before we lose Vinny, I just want to ask maybe, Vinny, if you had any comments, just following up from John. When John talked a lot about the different parts in the process. Like, when do you start thinking about procurement? Like, how early do you need to start thinking about it? And how do we make sure we're taking into the account the things that John's talking about here, the different things and the different issues you've raised, maybe in terms of the different models? I wonder if you just have some final comments about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and apologies for having to run a little bit early this morning. I think the question of when should you start thinking about it, like, really, it's really highlighted in that business case phase, and the earlier you can start thinking about it, the better. So often on projects, and this is across the globe, procurement's an afterthought. You get through the interesting, really sort of important stuff in lots of ways is what is the asset going to be like? What are we going to deliver here? What's going to be there at the end of the day? And then you get to the point where you're like, oh, we've got to go out and get someone to do this, and we'll just roll forward this last template that we used, or we'll just think about it at the last minute and throw it out into the market. I think when I talked before about there's no right or wrong models, that really is true. It's often about how you go about doing it and how you implement them. Even if every project continued to be a design bid build, but there was more planning and more thought up front, those would end up as better projects. It might be better that they go as a design build or a design build maintain, but really it's about acknowledging the risks that exist, thinking about how you manage those risks, and then thinking about how you manage those risks through procurement. If you're going to do a design bid build, and you know that for whatever reason that's the route you're going down, acknowledging that you're going to have these interfaces between your design and your construction, and your maintenance can help you put practices in place and put risk mitigation measures in place to ensure the success of your project. So the earlier you can start thinking about that, the better. When I help clients to consider and asset owners to consider procurement, it's a very collaborative exercise. We have a lot of workshops discussing what's important to the owner of that future asset, whether it's a First Nation or a municipality or at the moment in the New Zealand government here. And we sit down and we say, what is really important? Like, does this asset need to be delivered on time? Do you have a failing water system that you need to replace as soon as possible? Are you looking to get a lot of innovation? Like, really, it's a collaborative process. It's more about talking about what's important to you and making sure that that's reflected in your ultimate procurement process.
Great, thanks so much, Vinny, and thanks for joining us today. And maybe at this time, we've been talking a lot about these different models. It has been definitely a more technical discussion today, which I know some people enjoy more and some people enjoy less. But again, we will have the information available up on the website, the slides. We do actually have another document that we prepared, which covers some of the models that Vinny, that Vinny talked about and John talked about. Talks about, again, what is procurement, why is it important, what are the advantages of some of the models and the disadvantages. So we'll send that out to you afterwards, and it also will be available on the website. But we'll just pause here and ask, does anybody have any questions or comments about maybe projects you have in mind for your community and or your experience with procurement? We'd love to hear from you. I know we've been working on a couple of projects, as I think as mentioned during the course of our discussion here, supporting a wastewater project with an individual nation in Ontario, thinking through the procurement approach. We also been working with the BC First Nations Health Authority, thinking through how they do procurement, which is interesting because as a regional organization, right, they've actually got some experience using a couple of these different models. And we know there's some other maybe different types of organizations around the country that may be thinking about these things as well, right? Like a regional Indigenous organization maybe dealing with water, like the Atlantic Water Authority or others. But it's interesting to think how those different types of organizations might have different types of priorities, and how the individual nations will work with them as well. John, I don't know if you had any sort of thoughts about the different types. I know we've talked about, like, for example, a health facility. Would that have different issues as opposed to like a water facility?
Yeah, absolutely. The health industry is actually a really interesting one. Through our work with the First Nations Health Authority that Jason mentioned, we're seeing they've used design bid build as a means to procure services for the design and construction of their buildings. They've also done some design builds as well. And so within the health industry, First Nations health industry, if you will, we're seeing some of these more diverse models being used. And then if we were to broaden that in BC to provincial government agencies and health authorities for buildings, we're seeing quite a real trend toward design build and even design build operate in BC for health buildings. And that trend is also carried across other provinces as well. In Alberta, there's a lot of design build operative of health facilities there, and in Ontario as well. And so kind of as a general trend, if you will, we're seeing these optional models that Vinny referred to, design, build, operate, maintain, relevant with health facilities, and in BC anyway, some schools as well. School districts moving that way too. So we're seeing, I guess to summarize all that up, more in terms of buildings, not as much in the sort of linear infrastructure. We're not seeing that trend quite as strong yet in linear infrastructure like roads, water utilities, wastewater utilities.
What about this question, John? One thing that I've heard as we've done work with different groups is a real strong desire to have local participation, for members to have opportunities to participate in the project's, planning, of course, being engaged to think about the decision making, but also employment opportunities. What about, are there opportunities in building the project? What about, are there opportunities for jobs in operating the projects? Is it possible to have these types of opportunities available, even if you're going to pick one of the other models? Like, is that a conflict? Can we make sure and embed sort of local participation requirements throughout, or have you seen evidence of that?
Yeah, in short, yes, absolutely. And a number of different ways to do that. To write, for example, writing it right into the procurement document that the nation brings these really strong capabilities in this area. It could be a gravel and aggregate supply, which is run by a nation business. It could be the contracting company that the nation business has for building construction. It could be an environmental services group that the nation has. So lots of examples of where nations bring really strong capabilities to the planning, the design, the construction, and the operations of an infrastructure project. And where those are available, they can absolutely be written in to the procurement process to make sure first that those are properly engaged, and then second that additional capacity is built into those. So the learnings, if you will, that would come from those nation businesses and working with others through the project, that those are fully respected as well. So yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard in different projects too is maybe there's an opportunity for participation, but we haven't necessarily developed the skill set today, so we can't take advantage of the opportunity today. But just because we can't take advantage of it today doesn't mean we don't want to take advantage of it over time, for example. So are there ways that we can develop that and create requirements that, for example, over time there'd be increasing participation of local, it may be building on the same theme, right? But it seems like that would be a helpful scenario as well.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. If just with that, Jason, if I might reflect on a personal circumstance which our firm is involved with, we're working with Hwait First Nations, which is a modern treaty nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island, on the upgrade of the road that goes from Port Alberni out to Anakla, which is the nation's home and close to the community of Bamfield. And so a part of our working relationship with Hwait is absolutely that. It is actually both providing those capacity experience and capacity building opportunities for nation members and businesses. And then in addition to that, embracing the really well-established nation businesses that are in place. For example, they're a gravel supply company. So it can be both ways, and we're really honored. Well, first to have been engaged to work with the nation on that, and then also to be able to help to build some further capacity within the nation.
Great, thanks, John. I know we're coming close to the conclusion of our session here today, and really appreciate everyone dialing in to spend some time with us. Haven't seen any questions in the chat box specifically. Certainly we still have a few minutes if you'd like to ask one, or you can even just unmute yourself and ask it as well, which is just informal. We're in a meeting scenario here, so feel free to do that. But maybe before we give you a second to see if you want to unmute yourself. Not seeing anyone yet, but wonder if Allan, want to turn to you before we conclude our session and ask if you have any closing comments you wanted to make just about, I guess, some of the things you've heard today, and hopefully the opportunity for better infrastructure outcomes for all First Nations and closing that gap.
Yes, thank you everyone for the great presentation. It was clear and very understandable for someone very political like myself. And I'm just thinking back before the pandemic, one of the things I really enjoyed the most was community outreach, getting right into the communities with Jason, meeting with the chief and council and their team. We'd find out their infrastructure needs and their goals. Then we go home, and then Jason would organize his technical team to go back to that community based on the needs of that community. And so that's what we want to do. Right now it's going to be by Zoom, but sometime in the near future, I really look forward to getting into the communities and meeting you fine people that are engaged in making your communities better. So we want Vinny to be there to support you for as little or as long as you need us. And if you have any questions, get in touch with us. Email, call, whatever is easiest for you. And I want to thank the team that presented today. What a wonderful job you've done. And as many times as I've heard these presentations, I'm still learning more and more about infrastructure. So with that, HKCM, thank you everyone, and continue to stay safe and continue to support each other and continue to move forward. Once again, have a great day.
Thanks so much, Allan. And just to wrap up, I guess today you can expect a follow-up email from us, and we'll send along the slide deck and again the sort of backgrounder on procurement options. We are going to be back next week for another webinar, and we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about some specific project examples, which be less abstract, more concrete of thinking about projects. We wanted to talk about a couple of examples. One being a scenario where there's an infrastructure project that serves both members and leased lands, like it's say an economic development area. It could be non-member residents, living in a leased area. It could be a business that's located in a leased area. But how do you have a system that serves both members and ECDEV? And the other scenario we want to talk about is a multi-purpose facility. Maybe you want a community building. Maybe it has, administration offices. Maybe it has a health facility. Maybe there's an ECDEV component to it. How do you think about that kind of a project? So we'd love to see you again next week. And as always, please head over to finny.ca, fnii.ca, and close out and say thanks again for attending to everyone. See you next week.